The fateful Christmas night of 2023. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if someone, even just one person, had noticed the silent cries for help that cold Christmas night in New York City. December 24, 2023 was meant to be a night of hope and sparkling lights, but for me and everyone working the ER that evening, it became a memory carved painfully into the heart. Late that evening, as holiday carols faintly echoed through the emergency room corridors, and exhausted staff tried to hold on to a measure of holiday cheer, the doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in, cradling a tiny, limp figure. I remember the feeling, the immediate dread as I saw the child. He was so small, not yet 2 years old. His chart would later record his name as Michael, but that night he was just a baby trembling in the hands of a world that had failed him. His injuries stopped us all in our tracks. The medical team exchanged looks, hardly daring to breathe. We saw a collapsed skull, broken fingernails, limbs painfully deformed at the wrong angles, ancient and fresh bruises crisscrossing his skin, a brutal map of pain that did not spare even his most private areas. In the cacophony of medical drills and urgent calls for a crash cart, we hustled to stabilize him. Despite all our collective skills, despite technologies and medicines and prayers whispered under our breath, Michael's fragile body had endured too much. His life slipped away on a night when millions of children across the city were drifting off to sleep awaiting Santa. For Michael, there would be no Christmas morning. While his tiny hand grew colder in mine, questions raged in my head. How could this happen here, in one of the world's richest cities? Where were the safeguards, the check-ins, the visits that are supposed to protect every child? I saw his little face, scrapes barely scabbing over old wounds, and my heart ached. When the official time of death was called, the silence in the room was complete. The fairy lights in the waiting room outside mocked us. The joy on the television screens in the hallways felt obscene. As the police quietly slipped in, their eyes told me they had seen this before, each time hoping it would be the last. My mind kept replaying the horror. The paramedics recited the details. The child was found unresponsive, covered in inexplicable injuries. The woman who accompanied him, later identified as his foster caregiver, gave nervous, inadequate explanations. Still, we did our duty, cataloging every injury, contacting law enforcement, and praying that, at the very least, Michael's story would not be his alone. Even now, I can't shake the weight of that Christmas night. The world outside was celebrating, yet here inside these walls, the real cost of failing our most vulnerable played out in terrible silence. I wonder if those who hurt him understood the consequence, or if the system meant to intervene ever truly saw him. The only certainty I have is that no child should ever be alone, afraid, and brokenhearted on Christmas, or any night. Let this never be forgotten. A warning from the scene. Before the chaos had even settled, a subtle but chilling tapestry of clues began weaving itself in quiet corners of the ER. First responders were shaken, and the nurses, many with long years in trauma, spoke in hushed tones, their unease plain. Some whispered that, on the way to the hospital, the paramedics noticed details that didn't fit the foster caregiver's story. Odd patterns of injuries, redness where restraints might have been, and a sickly pallor that suggested longer-term neglect. As the boy lay on the gurney, his tiny hand still clutching a worn-down comfort toy, the medical team started cataloging injuries for the police. The lead ER nurse, a veteran of the worst New York winters and too many battered children, noticed tiny defensive wounds across his knuckles and shins, marks that spoke of quiet, desperate fights against someone much bigger. She looked at the paramedics, whose faces revealed more questions than answers. The social worker on call arrived, instantly suspicious when the foster mother's account shifted details, sometimes insisting the boy had fallen, sometimes blaming an allergic reaction. The discrepancy in time reported between when the boy was found and when 911 was called was also jarring. The first police officer on the scene, hardened by years of duty in one of America's busiest cities, watched in silence as the foster mother seemed far more anxious about paperwork than about the child's fate. The hospital's child advocacy specialist joined the scene at nearly midnight. She quietly pulled aside the foster mother. The resulting conversation, bristling, indirect, punctuated by odd silences, quickly made it clear that this was no tragic accident. The specialist's instincts screamed for a more thorough review. "Too many stories don't add up," she later wrote in her transcript. "The bruises were patterned, the explanations inconsistent. Someone in that house should have seen, should have known." As detectives began combing through belongings hastily bundled in the ambulance, the cumulative weight of these warning signs was not lost on the team. Behind the sterile beeps and Christmas decor in the waiting area, a mounting sense of dread mixed with the smell of antiseptics. This case, the staff all agreed, was not simply a failure of one-night supervision, but a warning siren about cracks widening within the system itself. It set the tone for one of the city's most scrutinized child welfare investigations. And, for those present, a night whose details would take a lifetime to forget. Michael's unwelcomed childhood. Michael was born in the spring of 2021 in a bustling Los Angeles hospital, a little boy whose first breath was marked more by uncertainty than celebration. His mother was painfully young and alone, having been abandoned by Michael's father while still pregnant. She herself was grappling with unresolved trauma and cyclical misfortunes, a string of relationships that began with hopeful infatuations but ended in chaos. Unable to gain stability, support, or affection from her partners, she was soon ensnared in disputes involving her most recent boyfriend, who brought not warmth and commitment but volatility and violence. In a desperate act, Michael's mother became entangled in a domestic incident with her boyfriend and his new partner. The event spiraled out of control, resulting in her arrest. While in holding, she discovered she was several months pregnant with Michael. Fearful for her future and aware of her growing inability to care for a child, she petitioned the court for temporary reprieve until giving birth. The court granted a brief freedom, yet all parties involved recognized this was a stopgap, not a solution. The mother, knowing she had neither the financial means nor emotional capacity to raise Michael, reached out to social services. She made the gut-wrenching decision to relinquish her parental rights. Social workers, alarmed by the history of instability and violence, flagged Michael's case for heightened vulnerability. When he was born in February 2022, the tragedy compounded. Michael's mother vanished shortly after childbirth. No farewell, no explanation, simply gone. Her phone calls went unanswered. Court orders for her appearance were ignored. Her whereabouts became a legal mystery, turning her from a participant in the story into a missing figure haunted by guilt and unresolved consequence. Thus, Michael's birth certificate became not just a document but the beginning of a battle for his belonging in the world. Michael was left under the care of his maternal grandmother. Elderly, with fragile health and spared means, she tried her best to meet his daily needs while working multiple low-wage jobs to keep a humble roof over their heads. She loved him fiercely, but the weight of survival in Los Angeles, especially for an older woman caring for a baby on her own, proved too heavy. Relief came in the form of a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Smith. A retired nanny, she approached Michael's grandmother and volunteered her help. With gentle hands and sharp observation, Mrs. Smith doted on the little boy with the kind of vigilance born from decades spent caring for children. As months passed and Michael grew, Mrs. Smith's heart grew attached. She put forth repeated requests to formally adopt him, wanting to offer him the velvet of stability she knew he deserved. The grandmother, however, worried about burdening Mrs. Smith with medical and legal expenses, hesitated. The emotional back and forth pulled at everyone. However, practicality won over affection. Pressed by the limitations of their situation, the grandmother eventually turned to the Los Angeles County Department of Child and Family Services for assistance in finding a permanent, safe environment for Michael. With mounting bills and age-related ailments tightening their grip, the grandmother signed the necessary documentation in late 2023 to hand over guardianship to a reputable non-profit, American Children's Aid, which operated out of New York and specialized in matching children with foster homes. While the organization's brochure promised warmth, professionalism, and rigorous oversight, the reality of transferring Michael out of his grandmother's city, removing him even from the comfort of Mrs. Smith's doting gaze, marked the beginning of a new, colder chapter in his fragile life. Michael was placed in foster care, assigned to a family vetted on paper but whose reputation in their local New York community was fraught with whispers of cruelty. Time and again, the paperwork declared each step to be in Michael's best interest. But for a little boy who had already lost one home after another, each transition only deepened the ache of displacement. Michael's early childhood was thus a patchwork of unfulfilled promises, missed opportunities for affection, and a haunting sense that he was always on the outside looking in, a child not just unwanted by fate but rendered invisible by the very systems meant to protect him. The separation and its consequences. The separation that marked the first irreversible turn in Michael's young life was not a single dramatic event, but a cascade of moments, each one dripping with its own kind of heartbreak. His mother, overwhelmed by a toxic relationship and entangled in cycles of emotional unrest and poverty, found herself physically and mentally incapable of providing even the most basic care for her son. The moment she decided to relinquish her parental rights was not made out of indifference, but from a place of deep exhaustion and desperation, a point where hope seemed so far gone that letting Michael go felt like an act of mercy rather than abandonment. Social services arrived like silent arbiters of fate, paperwork replacing lullabies, their words couched in clinical compassion. For Michael's mother, this was the final, devastating confession that she could not protect her baby from a world she herself could barely survive in. I often think about what must have gone through her mind as she signed those forms. What memories did she hold on to, and which ones did she allow to dissolve? The ripple effects did not stop there. Michael was placed with his maternal grandmother, an elderly woman already scraping by in a modest apartment on government assistance. She brought a fierce, protective love to the child, but the sheer weight of responsibility, combined with her declining health and the mounting costs of diapers, formula, and childcare, painted every day in shades of stress. Her hands shook as she tried to fill bottles, and her eyes always darted to the mailbox, anxious about the arrival of the next bill she could not pay. Michael's grandmother found hope, or perhaps just a lifeline, in the form of a trusted neighbor, Mrs. Smith, a retired nanny who lived down the hall. Mrs. Smith's small apartment, always filled with the aroma of fresh-baked bread, became Michael's second refuge. This elderly woman had a knack for soothing restless infants, and brought a kind of seasoned vigilance, noticing the smallest cough or the faintest fever. While Michael thrived under this dual care, the underlying instability remained. How sustainable was a system stretched so thin, relying on the goodwill of aging women already burdened by their own limitations? As the months passed, Mrs. Smith's affection for Michael grew into genuine attachment. She pleaded to adopt him, petitioning social workers, but the bureaucracy proved formidable. Financial concerns, legal fees, and the maze of foster care policies loomed large. Michael's grandmother, beaten down by practical realities, felt driven to seek institutional help, hoping a formal placement could offer her grandson the stability she herself could not. When Child Protective Services and a local child welfare nonprofit stepped in, the sense of separation became acute and undeniable. Paperwork flowed as easily as tears. Family court dates blurred past, hearings scheduled and adjourned, as Michael's fate shifted from the hands of kin to the files of caseworkers. His grandmother kissed him goodbye for what she hoped would be a better future, yet the pain of parting lingered like a bruise, a wound not glued by time or promises. This separation, meant to offer safety and hope, instead exposed Michael to the unpredictable tides of the foster care system. Each transfer added another scar of uncertainty, reminding all involved that the costs of survival, emotional, physical, and spiritual, are rarely felt by policymakers, but are borne in their entirety by the smallest, most powerless lives among us. The baby left behind after birth. Michael's story truly began in the stark linoleum corridors of a Los Angeles hospital, a place usually alive with the nervous anticipation of new families, but that February morning, it bore witness to a different kind of arrival. Michael's mother, still just a teenager and overwhelmed by a storm of recent trauma, delivered her baby amid a blizzard of fear and exhaustion. Moments after signing the discharge papers, she gathered only her personal belongings, leaving behind the pink and blue blanketed newborn sleeping in his plastic bassinet. To the hospital staff, it looked like another exhausted mother stepping out for air. But hours passed. Nurses began to worry when nobody came to claim the child, and calls to the mother's listed number rang endlessly. An unofficial alert swept the ward. Some whispered about her troubled background, past run-ins with law enforcement, a string of unstable relationships, and her palpable loneliness in the hours before birth. Eventually, hospital security confirmed the worst. She had vanished. Without ceremony, Michael was officially deemed abandoned. Automatic protocols kicked in. Social workers were contacted to assess the situation and provide initial care. The hospital staff meticulously documented every detail of the birth, even the soft tuft of brown hair on Michael's crown. As they bundled him into the pediatric unit, security notified LAPD, and a search for the mother commenced, though even then, the gravity of her absence weighed heavily on the staff. From his first day, Michael's life was shaped not by family celebration but by paperwork and uncertainty. Nurses did their best, rocking him to sleep, bottling up a mix of hope and sorrow with every feeding. Meanwhile, the state scrambled to reach any next of kin. The process was clinical, but the stakes were heartbreakingly human. Michael's maternal grandmother, herself frail and laden with grief, was tracked down after several days. She arrived at the hospital torn between shame for her own daughter's choices and a fierce protectiveness of her new grandson. The reunion was somber. No balloons, no congratulatory cards, only the whispered promise of trying to do better for this child. For Michael, abandonment was not a singular act, but the echo that colored every sunrise in his infancy. Hospital staff remembered the quiet in his eyes, not the wailing expected from a newborn separated from his mother, but a troubling calm. With each shift change, nurses would pass on gentle instructions about his feeding times and swaddling preferences, determined that he would start life with some measure of stability, even if only between institutional walls. Finding hope in despair. Michael's earliest months unfolded under storm clouds of uncertainty. His grandmother, a woman whose hands were marked by a lifetime of work, her hair streaked gray with worry, became Michael's whole world after his mother's disappearance. Each day presented new, grinding challenges. With meager savings, she juggled long hours cleaning offices by night and caring for Michael by day. Her heart overflowed with love for the tiny baby, but exhaustion and anxiety were constant companions. Bills piled on the kitchen table like silent accusations. The fear that she might not be able to provide for Michael was a shadow that never left her side. It was during one of those desperate evenings when Michael's colic screams echoed through the thin apartment walls that Mrs. Smith appeared with her quiet, reassuring presence. Mrs. Smith, a retired nanny with a reputation throughout the building for her steady composure and deep reserve of patience, had been watching the family from afar. Having raised half the neighborhood kids over the decades, she instantly saw the warning signs: frailty in Michael's limbs, the tiredness in the grandmother's eyes, a baby's shivering cry that betrayed a deeper hunger than formula alone could satisfy. Gradually, Mrs. Smith's involvement deepened. She started by volunteering simple help, watching Michael while his grandmother slept, bringing over fresh fruit, or teaching her how to make homemade broth for the baby. What began as neighborly goodwill soon blossomed into a lifeline. For Michael, Mrs. Smith's gentle songs and careful hands became as familiar as his grandmother's embrace. For the grandmother, this kindness meant the difference between collapsing and carrying on. Every so often, Mrs. Smith would broach the idea of adopting Michael herself. She promised him the stability he deserved, a real home and a legacy of caring forged from decades of loving children. But every time, practicalities intervened. Mrs. Smith's fixed pension barely covered her own rent and medicine. Legal paperwork and court fees seemed insurmountable mountains to an elderly woman on a tight budget, and Michael's grandmother, proud and haunted by guilt, could never bring herself to ask for charity. Meanwhile, the world outside seemed utterly indifferent. Social workers visited sporadically, asking questions but rarely offering help that truly mattered. Advice flowed freely: find a food pantry, apply for subsidies, but solutions came slowly, when they came at all. The bureaucratic maze often left families like Michael's waiting for a callback or lost in a shuffle of forms. Even at the community clinic, it was clear that sympathy alone was not enough to pay for prescriptions or secure high-quality childcare. Still, against all odds, moments of hope emerged. Michael laughed for the first time under Mrs. Smith's watchful eye. Occasionally a kind neighbor would slip an envelope of cash under the door, or a small group in the church would send diapers and baby clothes. Michael's grandmother began to believe, if only a little, that help would come if she just held on long enough. She cherished every tiny victory. Michael's first steps, his giggle when Mrs. Smith tickled his belly, the rare evening when the apartment was filled with the aroma of a warm meal. Each small sign of improvement was proof that, despite everything, there was life and love left to fight for. But the fragile equilibrium couldn't last forever. When Michael came down with a stubborn fever, both women realized how grave their situation truly was. The heating in the apartment was unreliable, the doctor's visits were expensive, and the city's safety net frayed at the edges. Mrs. Smith pushed harder, speaking to everyone she could: doctors, priests, old friends in City Hall. She researched nonprofits specializing in child welfare, lobbying for pro bono legal aid for Michael's case. She even offered to take in extra cleaning work, hoping the extra cash could tip the balance. Despite her efforts, the cracks in the system widened. Child Protective Services paid occasional visits, acknowledging the grandmother's remarkable dedication but urging her to consider official foster placement. The pressure grew fiercer with each call from social services and every worried glance from Michael's pediatrician. The worry lines around the grandmother's eyes grew deeper, especially the night Michael was hospitalized for a respiratory infection. Doctors quietly hinted that a child so vulnerable and a caregiver so taxed might fare better in a foster program. Although every good intention came wrapped in administrative caveats, the message was clear. Time and resources were running out. The bureaucracy became overwhelming. Forms were filled, interviews endured, references checked and checked again. Michael's grandmother hoped for a relative to step forward, but family was scattered or already burdened, and old friends had long since drifted away. Facing the impossible, she broke down in Mrs. Smith's arms more than once, feeling the crushing weight of her decision. Could she trust strangers with her grandson's fate, or condemn him to slow neglect by clinging to hope? Ultimately, Michael's best interests, at least as the system defined them, had to come first. His grandmother, racked with guilt and dread, initiated the process of seeking help from professionals who promised security and opportunity. Mrs. Smith continued to push for an open adoption, but the costs and red tape were insurmountable. In the end, the choice was made by a process of elimination rather than conviction. The authorities handed Michael's future to a reputable non-profit specializing in foster placements, and while their glossy brochures brimmed with smiling children and reassuring statistics, the leap of faith was agonizing for those who loved him most. As the day approached for Michael to leave the only home he had ever known, there was a lingering, desperate hope, unspoken but ever-present, that something or someone might intervene at the 11th hour. After all, isn't love supposed to conquer all? Yet hope here existed precariously on the edge of necessity and despair. The search for a miracle, a family friend, a well-wisher, or the sudden generosity of a caring stranger, defines the line between surrender and faith in a world stacked against the vulnerable. It is in this search that the true meaning of hope reveals itself. Not as a happy ending, but as the stubborn refusal to stop fighting, even if you suspect the odds are already written against you. Michael in the American foster care system. Michael's journey through the American foster care system began with a sense of finality masked by the sterile optimism of official paperwork. It was late autumn on the East Coast, the air brisk but promising when his grandmother, after endless battles with bureaucracy and the slow exhaustion of her own spirit, signed the transfer papers. Those forms seemed clinical, even hopeful, filled with words like well-being, supervised placement, and qualified foster caregivers. Yet for a small child like Michael, these promises meant leaving behind the last fragile ties of familiarity he'd known, to enter a world defined more by process and protocol than by affection. American Children's Aid had a glossy image, pamphlets lined with photographs of smiling caseworkers and happy children in coordinated shirts, testimonials about forever homes and second chances. Underneath the branding, the organization was a bustling hive of social workers, legal advisors, and foster parents, all vying for precious public funds and good press. On paper, everything about Michael's pending placement looked secure. His foster caregiver, Mrs. Foster, had years of experience, had completed mandatory training, and had no official complaints lodged against her in recent evaluation cycles. But as is often the case in sprawling systems, the gap between paperwork and reality was wide and dangerous. Arriving in New York was overwhelming for Michael, not just because the tall buildings and icy wind felt foreign, but because the transition was so abrupt. A caseworker, Jessica, was assigned to support the move. She briefed Michael's grandmother and offered check-ins, but schedules were busy, caseloads heavy. Michael's medical records, family background notes, and a stack of instructions were passed along as if a child's life could be summed up in a manila folder. In the new city apartment he would now call home, everything was unfamiliar, scents, sounds, even the silences. Mrs. Foster's house was filled with rules and routines. There was no harm, at least at first, in the way she welcomed him, measured, methodical, never unkind in front of others. Yet Michael quickly noticed the absence of warmth, the difference in how she held him versus how Mrs. Smith, or even his grandmother, had once done. Meals were structured, not shared. Comforts weren't spontaneous. Everything was earned, not given. He learned how to avoid eye contact, to mute outbursts of emotion. He grew quieter by the week, not because anyone ever demanded his silence, but because he learned it was safer that way. From the outset, the relationship between Mrs. Foster and Michael was transactional. To the caseworkers, she was the model foster parent, methodically signing off on each checklist visit. Her apartment was always neat, the fridge regularly stocked, and Michael, on the surface, seemed well cared for. but cracks were visible to those willing to look beyond the paperwork. Subtle signs crept in. Michael's reluctance to speak about his day at school, small bruises explained away as childhood accidents, the way he flinched slightly when someone entered the room unannounced. Jessica, the social worker, made her monthly visits but rarely stayed long enough to witness anything amiss. She'd ask standard questions: "Are you happy here? Is everything okay at school?" But Michael, ever careful, provided the answers he thought the adults wanted. His lessons in survival were expanding: how to hide in plain sight, how to keep secrets, how to recognize when kindness was conditional and contingent on pleasing those in power. The culture of the foster system itself, at least in Michael's experience, was one rooted in well-intentioned detachment. Caseworkers rotated often. Each time a new name appeared, it meant retelling the same story, never knowing which details to emphasize, what might matter. Jessica tried to maintain a thread of continuity, but her phone calls became less frequent. Mrs. Foster, increasingly set in her routines, discouraged visits from Michael's old life, citing his need for stability. Notes about minor injuries accumulated but were dismissed. "Kids will be kids," or "he's just a bit clumsy." At school, Michael kept mostly to himself. Teachers, pressed for time, saw a quiet, sometimes withdrawn child. He fell through the cracks, not quite a problem, never drawing too much attention. Only once did a sharp-eyed lunch attendant ask about the fading bruises on his arm. Mrs. Foster explained them away, insisting he was accident-prone, and because she seemed so organized, no one followed up. Inside Mrs. Foster's home, small rituals signaled which children were favored, and which, like Michael, always had to earn their place. He noticed how the older kids got extra desserts, warmer coats, a gentler tone. Minor infractions became major issues for him alone. A spilt glass of milk, a misplaced sock, a forgotten homework assignment. Mrs. Foster's corrections were cold and sharp behind closed doors, never physical at first, but always carrying a threat, building an atmosphere of anxiety that wore Michael down. The lack of true advocacy was echoed by the broader system. Although American Children's Aid marketed itself as a network of care, the reality was one of stretched resources and high staff turnover. Quarterly reports painted a cheery statistical picture, but didn't account for the subtle cruelty or day-to-day neglect that children like Michael faced. Anytime his case came up for review, the focus was on compliance with minimums, not the nuances of his well-being. The dignity and humanity of the child in question, Michael, was reduced to a set of numbers, deadlines, and bullet points on a whiteboard. Through the cold winter months, Michael began to slip into a routine of quiet vigilance. Nights were the hardest, the apartment was heated, but the cold inside was more emotional than physical. When he cried, no one noticed. When he succeeded, the praise was sparse. Mrs. Smith tried calling, sending cards, small packages, but Mrs. Foster returned them unopened or said Michael was too busy to talk. His grandmother wrote letters, but they rarely arrived, and when they did, were filtered through the watchful hands of Mrs. Foster. Each week, the sense that he was being observed more than loved became Michael's reality. There were intermittent moments of hope: a smiling substitute teacher at school, a neighbor who let Michael play for a few minutes in the hallway, a librarian who remembered his name. These small acts of kindness were flashes of light in his otherwise regimented world, reminders that not every adult was as distant as those who now managed his existence. But those glimmers weren't enough to change the broader reality. Michael was, in the eyes of the system, a file to be maintained, a number on a quarterly report, not a life to be cherished. Michael's foster experience was shaped by the contrasting currents of official oversight and real-life neglect. On the one hand, there were charts to fill and procedural visits, the ever-present language of protection and support. On the other, there was the emotional reality, a boy who learned to wait, watch, and rarely expect affection. American Children's Aid did hold reviews, but the mechanism for truly hearing a small child's evolving pain just didn't exist. Mrs. Foster's careful veneer, her literal and figurative closed doors, kept even the most suspicious eyes from seeing too much. Sometimes Michael would catch a glimpse of his own reflection in the window on a cold morning, thin, pale, but still hoping. He wondered if anyone noticed his gradual withdrawal, the deepening sadness overshadowing his once bright curiosity. No matter how hard Michael wished, the rules of this new world remained unmoved. He belonged to the system now, and while the system had many safeguards, what it lacked was the one thing he needed most: the steady, unconditional presence of someone who cared enough to see him, really see him, every single day. Systemic indifference and abnormal signs. From Michael's very first weeks in foster care, The bureaucratic detachment of the system became glaringly apparent. Not in grand, dramatic actions but in the dozens of subtle, almost invisible oversights that accumulated day by day. To any outsider, Michael's placement seemed like an unremarkably standard case. Caseworkers dutifully made notes, checked boxes, and filed reports, but the kind of presence that could have spotted suffering before it took root was plainly absent. Every few weeks, the designated social worker, Jessica, made her prescribed visits. She would knock politely, follow protocol, and ask Michael and his foster caregiver, Mrs. Foster, a series of routine questions, never probing too deep, always on a tight timetable. The answers she received were always just satisfactory enough to appease the forms she needed to fill. The clinical professionalism masked a deeper neglect, a hesitancy to question, a reluctance to linger long enough for the real truth to surface. At first, Michael tried to behave, eager to please and scared to do anything that might annoy his new caregivers. For Jessica, this behavior was a reassuring sign. On paper, Michael was well-adjusted. But as the months passed, small anomalies started cropping up. Mrs. Foster began refusing unannounced visits, citing Michael's schedule or family illnesses. Jessica, overworked and undersupported by her supervisor, rarely pushed back. In her notes, these refusals were filed away as reasonable accommodations. Then came the physical signs. A new cut across Michael's eyebrow, unrelated bruising on his arms, and a distinct drop in his weight. Mrs. Foster always had an explanation. He'd tripped, he'd scraped himself playing, he wasn't adjusting to new foods. Michael himself, by then withdrawn and wary, merely nodded in agreement. He instinctively learned how to tell adults what they wanted to hear. Jessica documented everything without ever stepping outside her neutral observer role. The system was designed to assume goodwill where paperwork indicated compliance. Meanwhile, hospital reports on Michael's recurring minor injuries began to accumulate. A chipped tooth, a sprained wrist, several bouts of unexplained nausea. Each time Mrs. Foster provided prompt, seemingly reasonable explanations. A fall on the playground, a stomach bug going around at school. The pediatrician's observations, always brief and crammed into hurried office visits, raised mild concern but nothing so urgent as to trigger immediate intervention. Each flag in the system was small enough to ignore. Each defensive statement from Mrs. Foster placated another level of oversight. This is the subtle cruelty of indifference within an overloaded system. Warnings don't emerge in red flashing lights. They seep in, quiet and nearly invisible, until they fill the entire room like carbon monoxide. Michael's longing for connection and the gradual erosion of his spark went unnoticed, drowned out by the daily churn of bureaucracy. Mrs. Smith, his grandmother's old neighbor, called often, requesting updates, asking to visit, sometimes pleading her case to different workers. Each attempt was met with a dead end. Regulations had shifted, visitation wasn't possible, continuity of care required limiting outside contact. With each rebuff, the circle around Michael became narrower and more airless. The culture of performance, presenting a good front for inspectors, putting on a smile when caseworkers arrived, became ingrained in Mrs. Foster's household. The other children, older and more practiced, quickly tutored Michael in how to keep to himself and not draw attention. Should Michael forget the lesson, there were consequences. Punishments could be subtle, a missed meal, a cold reprimand, hours spent in isolation. But the message was clear: be quiet, be invisible, and adults will leave you alone. Even at school, where teachers are often the first to spot signs of abuse, Michael's struggles stayed beneath the surface. He was quiet, startlingly compliant, and rarely caused trouble. His test scores hovered on the low side of average, yet he was polite and never disruptive, the kind of child who faded into the background. When a substitute teacher once mentioned the dark bruises on his arm, Mrs. Foster was quick to explain. She blamed it on roughhousing with classmates. The school system, already overwhelmed with its own caseloads and paperwork, accepted the answer and moved on. It wasn't only the professionals who were slow to notice. Well-meaning neighbors, occasionally seeing Michael with Mrs. Foster at the local park or carrying groceries, remarked privately on how he seemed frail or quiet, but dismissed their own concerns as oversensitivity. In a culture where minding one's own business is often seen as virtue, the impulse to speak up withered long before anyone considered picking up the phone. Michael became one of countless children who slip through the cracks because their suffering comes without spectacle, pain hidden beneath a veneer of order and civility. By the time his situation worsened, the system had grown so accustomed to interpreting everything through the narrow lens of plausible deniability that the warning signs became background noise. caseworkers received assignments in bulk, with limited resources, and little room for critical thinking. Review meetings focused on statistics, not stories. Charts were scrutinized instead of hearts. When Michael's health began to visibly fail, his hair thinning, his weight dropping, his demeanor hollowing into a blank stare, the professionals closest to him rationalized these signs away, buoyed by reams of paperwork that told them all was well. The most devastating aspect of this apathetic machinery was the chilling predictability. Every time someone came close to asking the right question, every time Mrs. Smith called or a nurse paused a second longer than necessary, there was another form, another explanation, another reason to look away. Those supposedly in charge of protecting Michael put their faith in regulation and process, mistaking compliance for care. Meanwhile, the very things that should have offered protection, quarterly reviews, home visits, standardized checklists, became defensive shields for the adults, not for the children in their charge. The system, built to protect, instead insulated itself from liability. As long as Mrs. Foster kept her home sufficiently clean and her story sufficiently polished, no one had cause or courage to dig any deeper. In this environment, the abnormal became normal. Michael's increasingly vacant look, his stunted emotional responses, the gulf growing between him and every source of genuine affection, none of it was loud enough to pierce the bureaucratic shell. If someone did notice, the impulse was to hope that someone else, somewhere else, would act. The myth of collective responsibility became the pretext for inaction. By the time the truth of Michael's suffering finally surfaced, it was already too late. His story, tragic as it was, revealed the system's worst failing, not just the existence of abusers or the indifference of individual caseworkers, but a culture that quietly taught everyone involved to ignore pain unless it screamed, and to tolerate dysfunction as long as it came with the right paperwork attached. Michael, a silence murdered in a glamorous house, Michael's existence inside Mrs. Foster's immaculate townhouse felt on the surface like a scene from a glossy family magazine. Each morning began with the mechanical sounds of routine, the clink of cutlery, the steady thrum of the dishwasher, voices lowered to polite, distant notes. The living room was decorated always just so, polished wood, expensive curtains, a sprinkle of children's toys neatly confined to corners, never strewn with the reckless exuberance one might expect from a house of young lives. To the outside world, this was the home of security and comfort. But for Michael, every day was marked by the oppressive weight of being seen, but never truly acknowledged, a silent figure tiptoeing through a stage set for someone else's performance. The warning signs, had anyone looked closely, were there for months. Small, almost invisible at first. Michael's uneven gait after a week's absence from school, the way he pulled his sleeves down to his wrists, flinched at quick touches, retreated at raised voices. Teachers at his elementary school noted the increasing silence, chalking it up to adjustment. Kids need time to feel safe in new homes, they reassured themselves. The system relied on reports and check-ins on the assumption that a stable address and compliance with scheduled visits equaled a child's well-being. But compliance can be meticulously staged, and Mrs. Foster possessed the kind of organizational ruthlessness that made deception look effortless. Michael's appearances changed as the months went by, fading bruises hidden under his shirt, hair thinning in patches, and a nervous picking at his already bitten fingernails. At first, Jessica, the social worker, recorded these as minor incidents, assured by Mrs. Foster that boys will be boys. Each injury, every anxious withdrawal was explained away with a tidy narrative. A fall on the playground, wrestling with older foster siblings, a seasonal fever. But these explanations ignored the context of Michael's growing fragility, the listlessness with which he approached even small joys. He became tentative, almost spectral. In a home bursting with material comfort, his spirit faded quietly, almost unnoticed. The house itself was a paradox. Mrs. Foster was never openly cruel in front of visitors or the other children. If anything, her manner exuded a brisk, professional warmth, the kind that reassures inspectors and caseworkers but leaves little room for spontaneous affection. Michael learned quickly to measure his words, his steps, even his breathing. Every misstep was catalogued, every overlooked chore met with mature, icy correction. The few foster siblings who shared the home had their own survival strategies: ingratiate themselves, stay out of trouble, quickly report on one another to curry favor. In this environment, Michael learned isolation, even while surrounded by others. Mealtimes offered a window into the home's odd hierarchy. The favored children sat closest to Mrs. Foster, received seconds or special treats, were addressed in a gentler voice. Michael's place was always the same, far corner, hands clasped, eyes lowered. He memorized the script. Don't speak unless spoken to, clean up after yourself, never show need. When he was unwell, comfort was clinical, a pat on the head, a muttered suggestion to get some rest. Nights were cold, even with the heat on, and Michael's thoughts would spiral into guilt. Why couldn't he be more like the others, less trouble, more easily loved? Occasional attempts to reach out were swiftly stifled. Letters from his grandmother arrived sporadically, censored or read aloud by Mrs. Foster before Michael was allowed to respond. Phone calls with Mrs. Smith faded, the line always busy or routed to a voicemail box that was rarely checked. On holidays, Michael was dressed in his best shirt for photos, a smiling, silent prop for Mrs. Foster's accounts. Visitors never stayed long enough to see past the polish. Jessica's periodic check-ins felt rehearsed. Questions were answered defensively, boundaries kept tight, and discomfort swiftly redirected. But the marks of neglect and quiet abuse accumulated, layer upon layer. Michael began to lose teeth prematurely, his hair fell out in uneven clumps, and he developed a listless cough that lingered through the winter. The doctor's notes never captured the full picture, only that Michael seemed underweight, perhaps prone to allergies or minor infections. The system required a glaring sign to trigger alarm, but Michael's suffering was insidious, a slow depletion spread out in 1,000 small indignities. The sense of being a shadow haunted Michael. At school, he retreated further. Teachers moved on to more disruptive students. Michael became invisible, a seat filled and paperwork checked. He stopped participating in art, play, or reading aloud, activities he once enjoyed with Mrs. Smith or his grandmother. Instead, he drew small, anxious doodles in the margins, houses with no windows, fields with one wilted tree, skies streaked gray. Whenever a substitute teacher or counselor expressed fleeting concern, Mrs. Foster had a ready answer, her explanations brisk and plausible. In the end, Michael's tragedy grew out of two incompatible realities. One was the performative care that satisfied checklists and audits, always keeping one step ahead of real scrutiny. The other was the silent, invisible ordeal of a small boy whose needs went unheard. Despite the veneer of a perfect foster home, Michael lived an existence muted of joy, muted even of hope, a quiet erasure in a house designed never to show its cracks. The price of such perfection was the extinguishing of a light nobody truly bothered to see going out. The night of tragedy and secrets revealed. The night of December 24, 2023, began like any other cold winter evening in Manhattan, its city lights twinkling through blue-black frost outside the windows of Mrs. Foster's polished brownstone. Inside, the order was as chilly as the air, children tucked away in their rooms, curtains drawn tight, every toy and teacup meticulously arranged. Yet below this surface perfection, there was a tension so taut it hummed quietly through the walls, a tension Michael felt deep within his exhausted, fearful body. No one noticed Michael at dinner. His lips were pale, his movements slow and hesitant, and when Mrs. Foster told him to eat faster, her words cut through the silence like steel. He tried to comply, but each swallow was an effort, his breathing shallow, chest rising in short, pained hitches. The other children stole furtive glances, but quickly learned to avoid drawing Mrs. Foster's attention when her mood grew sharp and restless, as if she herself was haunted by the sense of impending collapse. Around 10 o'clock, while Mrs. Foster busied herself with year-end paperwork for the agency, Michael made his way to the bathroom, clutching his side. He was feverish, shivering, skin branching with the bruises from weeks of punishments doled out just out of sight. When he stumbled, he whimpered, the sound quickly suppressed. Mrs. Foster heard the faint noise and, annoyed, called out a threat from the next room. "Get back to bed, Michael, or you won't see Christmas morning." His body was failing him, but his will to survive flickered, desperate for comfort. He crept into the shared bedroom, curling up on a thin mattress while moonlight cast cold stripes over his small frame. Hours passed in a blur of chills and distant street sounds, time skipping in fevered fragments. It wasn't until just after midnight, while New Yorkers outside toasted Christmas with laughter and jazz, that catastrophe struck. Michael's breathing stuttered, and then ceased. He clawed weakly for air, unable to call out loud enough to rouse the older boy in the top bunk above him. When Mrs. Foster came to check on the children in the early morning hours, she found Michael non-responsive, his lips blue, blood pooling in odd patterns, body terrifyingly limp. Her initial reaction was not horror, but calculation. She dialed 911, voice carefully trembling as she spun a story of an allergic reaction to milk, implying Michael had been sick all evening but she'd tried her best. Even as the paramedics rushed through her perfectly decorated foyer, Mrs. Foster answered their questions with measured, anxious concern. She insisted that everything had happened so suddenly, she simply hadn't realized the severity. The emergency response team, trained to expect the chaos of life or death, immediately sensed something was off. They read the room, its too careful cleanliness, the lack of panic, and especially the way Michael's injuries presented. Old and new bruises layered his limbs like a harrowing mosaic, his ribs shallow and thin, teeth marks and defensive scratches mapping out silent battles fought in the dead of night. As the team worked to resuscitate him, their eyes met in grim understanding. This was not a case of childhood accident. At the ER, Michael's lifeless form galvanized the staff into overdrive. The trauma team cataloged every mark with methodical horror, whispering amongst themselves about previous cases that looked too similar. Mrs. Foster, waiting stiffly in the corner, clung to her narrative, making small, practiced sobs and fielding questions with a precision honed by years of passing inspections. She repeated her story about milk and illness, coaching Jessica, the social worker who had arrived bleary-eyed and unprepared for the mounting evidence against them. Yet the truth would not stay buried this time. A hospital nurse who'd recently transferred from another borough and who bore the scars of a failed foster system herself, pressed the police to look further. "This isn't right," she murmured to the officer taking notes. "You don't get injuries like these from falling out of bed." Her persistence brought a detective back to question Mrs. Foster separately from Jessica, their stories growing less consistent by the hour. Meanwhile, the other children in the house were taken aside by a child psychologist. Under gentle, persistent questioning, Michael's closest bunkmate haltingly described nights filled with suppressed cries and the sound of blows muffled behind towels. He mentioned how Michael's food was sometimes withheld, how he once saw the boy locked in the bathroom after an imagined offense. One by one, small shreds of testimony cut through the web of respectability Mrs. Foster had woven through years of careful appearances. Back in the hospital, the final, damning evidence surfaced. The hospital security staff, following new protocols for suspected abuse, pulled home surveillance footage secretly provided by a housekeeper fearful for the Foster children's safety. The footage captured enough. Snatches of Mrs. Foster's quick, cold reprimands, times when Michael was handled too roughly, his little wrist twisted, his pleas ignored. On audio tape, the thin, shaken voice of Michael himself could be heard apologizing for soiling a sheet, followed by the kind of silence only violence can bring. By dawn, the reality was inescapable. Detectives arrested Mrs. Foster on charges of child endangerment, neglect, and aggravated assault, with Jessica named as a possible accomplice for her failure to report mounting red flags. The steely facade of Mrs. Foster's professional caregiving began to crumble under the weight of testimony, evidence, and her own inability to keep all her stories straight. As news broke within the hospital, first among exhausted nurses, then as a whisper through the ER, shock turned to sorrow and then to anger. One nurse clenched her hand, whispering, "Not on Christmas, not another one." The tragedy spilled beyond the cold, clinical confines of that December night, igniting a firestorm of outrage throughout the city. Journalists gathered under the hospital's harsh floodlights, pressing for details, as advocacy groups assembled to demand investigations into American Children's Aid and dozens of similar cases. Yet, for Michael, the fight was already over. What remained on that bitter night was not his voice but the echo, a chilling reminder of what can happen when a system mistakes performance for care, and a house's shine hides the rot beneath. His story would live on in the testimonies, reforms, and tears that followed, turning what was meant to be a silent, hidden tragedy into a clarion call for all who would listen, expanding the investigation and exposing hidden dark sides. The days following Michael's tragic death became a storm of cascading revelations and mounting public outrage. The New York Child Protection Authorities, pressured by indignant media and advocacy groups, launched a comprehensive investigation, not just into Mrs. Foster and American Children's Aid, but into the wider culture of accountability, power, and secrecy shrouding foster care in the city. At first, the focus was squarely on Mrs. Foster. The housekeeper's courageous act of submitting video and audio evidence proved undeniable. Snippets of hidden camera footage showed Michael's thin frame being yanked down hallways, harsh reprimands meted out in cold, biting tones, his meals weighed with punitive precision. Audio clips revealed chilling exchanges, Michael's trembling apologies, the icy commands of Mrs. Foster, the silences that echoed after each outburst. These files, some dating back months, became the foundation of an airtight legal case. Mrs. Foster was quickly charged with aggravated assault, child endangerment, and criminally negligent homicide. The scope, however, grew much larger as the investigation deepened. Authorities discovered a troubling web of complicity. The housekeeper, whose own undocumented status left her at risk but whose conscience finally outweighed her fear, testified that Mrs. Foster's sister, Miss Helen, had also participated in the pattern of abuse. Miss Helen, a foster caregiver on contract with the same agency, was regularly present during disciplinary episodes, and sometimes delivered them herself. She supplied excuses and adjusted logs to minimize scrutiny. She'd even coached the other children on what to say should anyone ask about Michael's injuries. As detectives pored over American Children's Aid files, more cracks appeared. Personnel records showed 3 separate emailed concerns about Michael's bruising and withdrawn demeanor, emails that went unacknowledged, then quietly deleted by a case manager, who later claimed workload stress as a defense for the oversight. In other cases, home visits were documented on days when caseworkers never arrived. Several visits were described as drive-by check-ins from the curb, without anyone actually entering the house. Supervisors at the agency, eager to retain their largest clients and government contracts, had fostered a culture in which smooth paperwork and upbeat reports eclipsed any real child-centered scrutiny. As official scrutiny deepened, the scope of complicity grew. Investigators uncovered a recurring pattern, a subtle collusion between overworked social workers, overburdened foster parents, and lazy administrators. Case after case revealed social workers marked present for home visits they never completed, reports rubber-stamped with digital signatures, and feedback from children routinely summarized without interviews. A whistleblower from inside American Children's Aid spoke up, providing anonymized summaries of a culture of silence. "If you ask too many questions, you don't last long. The priority is keeping cases flowing and numbers looking good." She described pressure to close files rapidly, avoid problematic children who threatened to raise statistics on failed placements, and suppress internal complaints that might threaten funding. For Michael, these silent corners of the bureaucracy became deadly. The system failed to listen not because evidence was absent, but because listening was punished as a risk to organizational survival. Parallel investigations by law enforcement and city officials found that the local Department of Social Services had delegated nearly all oversight responsibility to agencies like American Children's Aid, without allocating appropriate budgets for checks and balances. Training programs were outdated or perfunctory. Despite public promises of transparency, the organization funneled funds toward PR campaigns and administrative bonuses rather than investing in lower caseloads, trauma-informed training, or meaningful advocacy for foster children. Even external audits were bypassed or arranged by insiders who had a stake in preserving the status quo. As media pressure mounted, a new task force was formed. They subpoenaed phone records, unearthed hurriedly deleted emails, and interviewed dozens of children who previously passed through Mrs. Foster's home. A disturbing pattern emerged: children afraid to speak up, their stories ignored or translated into sanitized case notes, marks and bruises explained away and never followed up. One little boy described hiding under a bed for hours, too afraid to move. A teenage girl recounted being denied food as punishment. For every Michael whose story became public, there were many more whose pain remained buried in paper files and bureaucratic neglect. The findings horrified the city. Parents, teachers, and local activists gathered outside the agency's offices, their signs demanding justice not just for Michael, but for every child ensnared in the system's blind spots. City council members called emergency hearings. Network anchors led nightly segments on the foster care crisis. The mayor issued statements promising sweeping reform, but for families like Michael's, those promises felt hollow against decades of systemic rot. The final report from the task force was damning. It detailed a chain of negligence, professional indifference, and active concealment. It named names: administrators who signed off on false reports, social workers who ignored calls from concerned neighbors, foster parents shielded by personal connections inside agencies. The report pulled no punches. This is not an isolated tragedy, but the product of a failing culture that sees vulnerable children as statistics, not human beings. Victims' advocates pushed for criminal indictments against agency executives, not just frontline staff. Civil lawsuits were filed on behalf of Michael's surviving relatives and other former foster children impacted by Mrs. Foster's tenure. Federal authorities announced a wider probe into foster care funding statewide, seeking to root out similar collusion and abuses in other agencies. the wave of awakening and the desire for change. In the bleak wake of Michael's story becoming public, something in the city's mood shifted, first a tremor beneath the surface, then a growing movement impossible to ignore. As chilling details of the boy's life and the failures of the foster care system unfolded across headlines, a collective sense of outrage and heartbreak swept through New York and far beyond. Michael's tragedy struck a raw nerve, serving as a mirror to a nation's conscience and shaking awake the moral awareness that had too often slumbered under the weight of bureaucracy, red tape, and misplaced trust. Suddenly, the narrative of neglected children was no longer safely abstract or tucked away in annual reports. It had a name, a face. It became real for people who had never before paused to consider the invisible suffering just streets away from their own holiday celebrations. Candlelight vigils sprang up outside the courthouse and foster agency headquarters. People who never met Michael wept openly for him. Nurses, teachers, grandmothers, college students, caseworkers, and parents gathered under winter skies, clutching handmade banners inscribed with slogans like "Children deserve more" and "No more forgotten Michaels." The city, often jaded by daily crisis, now found itself united in compassion. Even frontline workers hardened by years of exposure to suffering felt a wave of renewed purpose. Perhaps at last indifference could crack, and real change might take root. Advocacy groups seized the momentum. In the days and weeks that followed, child welfare organizations, parent associations, and networks of former foster youth organized forums and town halls. Survivors of the system spoke their truths to packed audiences, describing in harrowing detail their journeys through neglect, the pain of being unheard, and the small acts of defiance that helped them survive. Their voices lent Michael's silent suffering a chorus, demanding to be heard by those in power. Calls for reform shifted from the idealistic to the urgent. Better training for caseworkers, lower caseloads, mandatory and random welfare checks, more trauma-informed approaches in dealing with at-risk families. Social media proved a megaphone for outrage and hope alike. Hashtags in Michael's name trended nationwide, sparking powerful threads of testimony, solidarity, and calls to action. Young people posted their own experiences of being failed by the system. Well-known journalists and celebrities amplified the message, pushing lawmakers into the uncomfortable spotlight of immediate scrutiny. Campaigns gathered steam, demanding public audits of foster agencies, transparency in nonprofit funding, and, most importantly, the creation of a robust, independent body to oversee the welfare of vulnerable children who had, for too long, relied on organizations more invested in appearances than in honest care. The city's political apparatus, unaccustomed to this level of grassroots cross-sector anger, responded with public hearings marked by raw testimony and pointed questioning. News footage captured mothers and former foster children describing not just Michael's ordeal, but the systemic neglect and cultural indifference that allowed such tragedies to proliferate. City council members, some openly emotional, others stricken by guilt or fear for their own legacies, pledged an overhaul of oversight protocols and a zero-tolerance approach to falsified records. Proposals flooded the legislative floor: stricter background checks, whistleblower protections for staff who reported abuses, requirements for real-time digital monitoring in foster homes, and the construction of smaller, more community-integrated units to prevent any child from slipping through impersonal cracks. Behind the policy announcements, everyday people got involved in ways both symbolic and practical. College students volunteered to tutor and mentor foster youth. Families stepped forward to foster and adopt children whose placements had been destabilized by the investigation. Churches, synagogues, and mosques opened their doors for outreach. Local businesses donated everything from meals to legal assistance. Pediatricians brought their concerns directly to policymakers, sharing grim statistics as well as proven protocols for early detection of abuse and neglect. Teachers underwent updated training to recognize subtle warning signs, with a renewed sense of obligation to report every concern no matter how small. Not all responses were simple or easy. Bureaucratic resistance reared up where reform threatened old networks of comfort and finance. Some agency executives pushed back, arguing that blame lay with a few bad apples and not the entire system. Yet the Michael case had forced a reckoning. Repeated oversight failures could no longer be explained away as anomalies. Many within the ranks, including longtime social workers and senior city officials, felt compelled to break their silence, coming forward with stories of ignored warnings, intimidating managers, and a culture of prioritizing appearances over children's lives. A pivotal moment arrived when a group of former caseworkers, many traumatized themselves by years working inside the flawed system, stood together at a televised town hall. They recounted impossible caseloads, a lack of meaningful support, and the emotional toll of knowing, intuitively, that children were suffering, without the power to intervene meaningfully. Their confessions prompted an outpouring of public empathy in turn, and led to loud, persistent calls for increased funding, better mental health support for staff, and a wholesale top-down restructure of city child welfare programs. Across the state and nation, the story grew even larger. Lawmakers in other cities and states, wary of similar tragedies and drawn by the urgent example, convened special sessions to audit their own foster programs. National coalitions emerged, aiming to develop digital monitoring solutions and public tracking of every child in care, technology to ensure that faces like Michael's would never be lost again behind checklists or neglected by absentee managers. Legal experts, advocacy journalists, and academics joined forces to draft frameworks for independent civilian-led bodies empowered with subpoena authority and binding enforcement, a vision of true accountability not beholden to agency politics or budgets. Crucially, the discourse began to shift from simple outrage or blame to a deeper, more nuanced reckoning. The failures in Michael's case were not purely technical or administrative. They pointed to fundamental questions about empathy, the meaning of protection, and the ways society consigns the most vulnerable citizens to the shadows. Town halls and editorial pages echoed with the voices of those demanding that "never again" be more than a slogan, urging for a transformation in the values that guide every level of intervention, from hiring to home visits to budgeting priorities. In this new climate, hope mingled with a fierce, deliberate energy. Those who had learned to accept the system's inertia were inspired, at last, to believe incremental progress was not enough. The times called for nothing short of a cultural shift. Community organizing flourished. Survivors spoke not just of their pain, but of what healing looked like in practice: sustained, individualized mentorship, reunification where possible, the right to stable, loving homes, and trauma-informed education and care from adults equipped to recognize and address childhood suffering early. As the months passed, reforms began to crystallize into law. Independent oversight bodies with real authority started conducting unannounced audits. Funds were diverted away from shiny brochures and into evidence-based support, family reunification programs, community counselors, ongoing training for foster parents. City officials issued regular public reports. There were setbacks, moments of resistance in the old corridors of power, but the momentum held, powered by the specter of a small boy and a city's promise to never let indifference win again.